Fanny, I was so looking forward to seeing you in person and sitting next to you and congratulating you for this incredible accomplishment.
Mhm.
And I have to be honest, it feels, with this book in particular, it feels weird to do it digitally because it's such a sensorily alive book. And I kind of like, pictured us like holding hands over like a bowl of mandarins.
Yeah.
And I want to acknowledge that disconnect because it's like it's such an alive book. Um, so that it's a screen and not in person is strange.
It is a very strange thing. It's also, I couldn't have named the book a more insanely prescient title for this. So I almost feel like I'm to blame for this disembodied outcome here. Um, so anyways, apologies for being prophetic with that
So
title.
prophetic. Um,
Um, and I'm very sorry not to be in person with you too tomorrow. I know we will have that moment eventually, but it does feel like a loss. I think, one of the things and one of the reasons I'm so pleased to be speaking with you tonight is because I think we share something around how we describe senses and the way that you need to engage in a really sensory way with cooking. And so yes, I was looking forward to holding hands over mandarins.
but I didn't get to read the book until this all started. And I have to say, to you and to anybody who's here with us who doesn't have the book yet, there is no more wonderful escape from the like insular, isolated world of this moment than this book, because it's the best kind of escape where you're just tasting things and smelling things and seeing colors and gradients of color, and that's so beautiful.
Mm, thank
So
you.
even though the in-person part is not happening, I do there's that how sensorily rich it is as a book is very helpful in this
I
moment of not
found
being able to.
to just glom onto that, I will say also the shortness of the stories. Like you don't need a major attention span to you can, it's a vignette structure. They're all like very manageable lengths. Like I feel like all of our, we have a very kind of, my attention span feels really atomized. I just don't, and kind of frenetic, and it's been hard to settle. And getting into like poetry has been easier. I'm like literally my attention span is haiku level right now. So these are slightly longer than haiku, but they don't require that you be, fully engaged for hours and hours. Like you can just kind of dip in, travel somewhere else mentally, and then just dip back out. So I didn't intend that to be the case, but it turns out that it's also a helpful
Yeah,
part of the structure.
yeah. Um, that there were a couple of things I really wanted you to read because when I read them, I was like, okay, I was like, this is one of the moments in the book that it really um, felt to me like it kind of emblematized and opened up um, the story you were telling about your upbringing and your experience. And because we were just talking about the sensory world, I thought that there was one I had flagged for you. I think it's in France with Lulu.
Oh
Um,
yeah, the
you guys
muscle.
are, yeah. And I wondered if you could read that, because that was one of just the richest things where I felt like I was there. Yeah, so read
So for all of us who are stuck at home, I think it's probably worth also including just a little smidgen of the paragraph ahead of the one that you mentioned, which is where Lulu, who is 102 years old, who is the matriarch of this, renowned, beloved winery that I've been visiting since I was a baby, and that my mom adores and serves the wine at Chez Panisse. She has been drinking a copious amount of red wine every day. And I think we all need to know that you can drink a copious amount of red wine right now and feel okay about it. Like that's like libations are condoned by me, also by Lulu. And she says, and I remember asking her when I was a kid, and so I'll just start there. When I was younger, I asked Lulu once why she never drank water. I had seen her drink little other than red wine, an occasional glass of champagne, and a scant cup of herbal tisane before bed. She turned to me, her hazel eyes glinting with mischief, and said, Je ne bois jamais d'eau. Si tu bois de l'eau, tu rouilles. which means I never drink water. If you drink water, you rust. It wasn't just the vines that her son Francois knew. He was likewise a connoisseur of the wild edibles of the region, and like his mother, was adept at corralling the robust flavors of the Provençal wilderness in his home cooking. Wild savory, say, or the green seeds of roadside fennel, the innermost kernels of wild cherries. These things were at home in his kitchen. He was also, incidentally, one of the best cooks in my early childhood. I yearned to be invited to his house for an aperitif, and a daytime visit meant he might have a fire going to grill mussels, which I love more than anything. I don't think there's a more delicious way to prepare them. He used something like my mother's Tuscan grill, which actually I think you can probably see the faint shadow of behind me, placed low over the coals and made a fire from vine shoots, called sarment in French, which keep their slender vegetal form even after they've been transformed from wood to ember. Francois would shuck the mussels and set them down open-faced on the grill, dousing them in a bit of olive oil he made from the domain's old mangled olive trees, and adding a quick grind of black pepper at the end. As we waited, we ate the green olive cassé he'd cured himself, using the ash from his wood fire and the green flowers and seeds of blossoming wild fennel. The mussels would begin to whistle from the grill as each one came to a boil in its own brine. At just the moment when they were completely cooked through, Francois would pluck them from the grill, and his adored wife, Paul, would offer them to us on a platter, along with the sliced heel of the loaf of bread she'd made. The taste of the sea, the flavor almost figgy of the vine fire and the smoke infusing the flesh, the oil mixing with the broth cast from the mussels as they cooked, each one a soupy and smoky delight. I'm like holding a mussel here, a fake mussel, just like ready to give you.
I was about to say that. What I just noticed, this is actually going to segue before I meant to into my next thing I wanted to talk to you about. But we can come back to sort of senses and sensory richness. But as you were reading, I noticed you doing all the things. You were holding the mussel. You put on the olive oil. Did you know that you're?
I was suddenly acutely aware of it midway through, and I was just so wanting to have mussels here. Just, you know, it's like became cooking charades.
But so that was a thing that I have been made fun of my whole life. That's not true. My whole like grown up last 10 years life, maybe 15 years, for the fact that when I talk about anything, particularly cuts of meat or like parts of some kind of vegetable, I do it on my body. So when people ask what something is, I always say like, it's the shoulder or like, it's the sirloin. When I saw you doing that, I was like, I wonder if this is one of the many things that somehow this massive Japanese family had all started doing this, like this culinary pantomime.
I love that. We should actually have a culinary pantomime. It would be good. Japanese culinary pantomime once a year on Christmas, maybe, would be a welcome thing. My mom, well, you know, my mom definitely does do a lot of, not just hand talking, it's like a very evocative way of using her hands. And there is actually a chapter in the book that's kind of almost entirely dedicated to what her hands look like and how they feel and why they seem so particular to me. And also the way that she uses them, which is, you know, even still, I'm now living with her and have been for the last month, just to sort of be able to help her out in this period. And I just, you know, reminded of how much I both love and am still like have a different and divided sort of way or opinion about how to, you know, the hand washing thing, for instance. My mom was like, just never a hand washer, just like not a thing. I feel like I have a 76-year-old, you know, child that I'm instructing on how to properly wash hands, because it's like, you know, she would rinse them or whatever, but this idea of being so fastidious about hygiene, you know, it's like everything was a kind of continuous touching. You were touching the meat, you were seeing if it was done, you were wiping your hand quickly. I mean, you know, still an eye to food safety. It wasn't reckless, but it just wasn't precious about it. It wasn't precious or overthought or over careful. And now I'm like, get your hands in the sink, woman. Wash them thoroughly. You know, like it's funny. It's like I'm watching the whole chapter about exactly those as exactly that chapter, I mean, the description of her hands and how as a kid I was sort of anxious about bacteria, even though I didn't really know what they were or meant or how to dispel bacteria or any of that. But like, it's just sort of reliving it 26 years later, which is crazy.
What smells do you remember on your mom's hands?
God, always, always her red wine vinegar, because she would toss salad with her hands, which is something that I do too now, of course. But and I think it's important because when you toss salad with your hands, you can see exactly how much dressing is on there, and you get a sense of whether you're underdressing or overdressing. And it becomes a kind of sensory apparatus that also becomes an aid as a cook in terms of how you gauge things, which was, so she would toss lettuce and then later putting me to sleep, and I just be like, Mom, your hands reek of vinaigrette. I can't take it, because you can't get vinegar and garlic out of your hands for like, it takes a full day for it to dissipate.
I think that you should take this opportunity to make it very clear that you can't dress salad not with your hands. Like,
yes, I agree.
Because you can't, I don't think it's physically possible. And it's worth just telling everybody that since you're in.
We're here to tell this entire Zoom Books Are Magic event was organized around Tamar and I telling you this very important public service announcement, which is toss your salad with your hands. Wash them beforehand, but then toss it with your hands so you can really tell how much dressing you need, and then also you could then just taste a leaf, And of course, I understand that you might want to serve the lettuce at the table. Of course, I come over to people and just give them a claw of salad, and take it for granted that they're all familiar enough with, my methods that they won't be horrified. But you can serve with salad servers. I believe in salad servers at the table, but I do think that when you're making a salad, it's the only way to really know. And of course, it's the way that they make it, at any restaurant cooks, or at least at Chez Panisse, you'd be tossing in the bowl and you'd be able to quickly adjust and really know. It's like the intuitive knowledge that's in your fingers, even before your brain has computed, which is what I talk about a lot with my mom in terms of why she's using her hands, is not because she's a reckless banshee, although sometimes I've thought otherwise, but it's because there's a moment of knowledge that happens when you're touching something and smelling something before those senses coalesce and you actually make sense of it in your head. And it's like you can do the correction, or you can change the course of something before you've mentally computed it. And I think that's a kind of intuition that you actually can really educate. And you educate just by yourself by doing it.
That's also part of why it was so illuminating for me to read your book, because I also, it was like getting the backstory of a story that I lived a little bit. I mean, like, nobody talks about senses in particular when you're cooking at Chez Panisse, which I did. That's our connection. But like, the only instruction you ever get as a cook there is to taste something. That's it. There's no other, it's just like, is it done? It's just taste it. Like, and that's how you know. There is no other way of knowing. Somebody else can't tell you. There's no measurement that's right, because, it's different lettuces that day. It might be a different vinegar that day, like that whole thing. And it was really wonderful to kind of read you learning how to do that without anybody saying taste it, but you were kind of learning, the idea of like, taste it about everything. Like, you taste it.
Not to over determine the connection, because my mom does speak about it at length, but I do think that the whole culinary ideology stems from Montessori, stems from that. You don't go out and tell the kid what to do. You let the kid go out and learn it and learn what they're doing themselves. And then you can lightly guide and protect, but you're mainly asking the child to go and explore. So my mom would let me out in the garden and just kind of let me figure it out, and I was tasting all kinds of things, eating dirt. I ate, snails out of the garden once. I mean, so doing things that I think would horrify a modern parent maybe, but that is also, I think, how she approached and how the culinary pedagogy at Chez Panisse is kind of approached, which is you do learn by doing it. And also the knowledge that each individual has contributes to the whole, that it might be that someone else's, a more junior cook's palate is more tuned in a certain way. And so it's not presumed that there's a top down kind of knowledge or sense of what's right. And I love that about Chez Panisse, that it really doesn't feel hierarchical. There are still 4 chefs there, and all of the cooks on the line taste things together right before service, and everyone's giving feedback, and last minute little changes are made. And I do think that, I never really cooked there professionally. I would do these stints when I was in high school and then in college, and I learned so much, genuinely so much of the real technique of my cooking from those periods. But it's also how I think in the kitchen, I think, as a result of just being immersed in that kind of egalitarian and also just very sense-driven approach.
How does it feel to share your mom with so many people?
It's never really been like a problem for me somehow. I think one of the things I really maintain, I describe myself, I don't know where and when I came up with this, but I describe myself as having an 8-sided heart. And I think that,
I don't know what that means, but that's beautiful.
I think, and definitely not don't think of it as a stop sign. We're not talking, we're talking dimensional, almost like an 8-sided die or something. And I mean that to suggest that there is a capaciousness in how I'm able to love people or feel an expansiveness, that it's not, that I don't feel confined. And I think I learned that from my mom. I think love, I never felt any diminution of love because I didn't feel like there was a bounded quantity or a limited quantity. And so even though she has so many friends who depend on her and on whom she depends, and so many people she loves, and so many surrogate children, and so many people in her network, and also many, 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 many fans, somehow she just managed to keep the level of attention and love and care going for me that never made me feel like I was being overlooked. And in fact, when people ask me what's the secret? Why do you get along so well? I'm it's just, I think, the just genuine understanding in my core of my being that her love was totally unconditional. And I realize that sounds super platitudinous and kind of cliche, and yet it's just the most true element of our relationship, or it's the kind of bellwether of it.
No, I don't think it does. It sounds honest. I felt I had this weird feeling when I was reading your book that was wait, this is so. I had these moments where I would think, oh, what a coincidence! I seem to have the same palate as Fanny. I love garlic and bitter greens too. And then I was the same person taught us how to cook, right? Obviously your mom didn't, but Cal did, and Jean-Pierre did, and the people that she hired taught me how to cook. And I was it's so weird that there are all of these people that were taught really not just the same palate, but the same approach to food and the same approach to aesthetics. And if you go, have you noticed that when you go to any former Chez Panisse cook, or even maybe Chez Panisse server's house, they all look pretty similar?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I was joking about this with my friend Claire Patak, who is a pastry chef at Chez Panisse and now has this wildly popular bakery in London called Violet. And she was a former Chez cook because they will have put as much effort into the front of house as the back of house. There's total continuity in terms of how much regard there is for space. The back of the house is not ugly. Likewise, the front of the house needs to have flowers. There's always, there's these considerations for things which I think are sometimes overlooked. My mom said for the first time, I hadn't heard her say it so explicitly, and she was talking about how for her it was so important that the back of the restaurant was still a beautiful place to be, that even if it was never seen by customers, Like that's where the core of the family, everyone who was employed by the restaurant is there. And it's like, they need to feel cared for. It needs to feel beautiful. It can't feel, it still has to be functional, but it can't be this throwaway space. And I think like there are just very few restaurants. I've worked in other restaurants. I worked at, in various capacities when I was younger in college, and it just wasn't true of anywhere else. Like that level of regard. I mean, it's almost to the extent that it's kind of like over the top in the kitchen, for instance, like every metal surface in the Chez Panisse that could be clad in copper was clad in copper. I mean, like including the massive, walk-in door and whatnot. So some of these fanaticisms were taken to a very fine art. But in general, I think there is something about that, just the porosity, which meant that between the aesthetic, or rather this sort of universality and of the aesthetic, which is why it felt so total, even for me in my house. And I think also why I felt like Chez Panisse and my house were almost interchangeable spaces to some extent,
Right.
Was that my mom's aesthetic was applied very rigorously to both all the time, to every aspect of it.
Because we're talking about aesthetics, and I'm in my carriage house, which are my own.
Oh yeah.
You have one nearby there?
Oh, I've got a spoon. You know it.
You got a spoon?
Let me just, the limits of my earphones here.
Oh, hi, spoon.
One of the great tools.
Great tools. So you guys at Permanent Collection, you started making these, right?
Yes. So Permanent Collection is this little design brand that's about 3 years old. But it actually initially was not started with any intention to make kitchenware exactly. It was coming off of my more sort of art and design focused studies. I started the company with my friend Mariah, who's also a design curator. So we started working with different artist estates, and it was kind of clothing, very limited clothing items that were designed after vintage pieces, and then working with contemporary designers to make objects and homeware and stuff. And then we realized like what people wanted, and also the direction we were interested in exploring was kitchen products and things that were modeled after, inspired by my mom's favorite pieces. They were all, historical pieces. So we have a very small little collection of kitchen items that stem from that collaboration. But the egg spoon, and actually it was your Grub Street diet that kind of almost set this off for me when we were launching the egg spoon, because you were getting what I felt was kind of the same unfair criticism that my mom would get anytime she used this egg spoon. It was like, you would get like, it was kind of, R.I.P. Anthony Bourdain, but he loved to kind of like just ridicule and razz, especially like my mom, even though this spoon is a fucking huge iron implement that you use in fire. Yeah. Like, as if it was like twee or feminine or precious,
They're forged in fire. You use them in fire. They will last forever.
There's so many things that recommend this spoon and that also don't like pigeonhole them as like some kind of twee feminine, like old fashioned or out of touch kind of, whatever the various things. Like my mom would get called precious for using this thing. It's like, if Francis Ballman was using that spoon, like he would be called a badass. And I think there's a real double standard to how, women and, Tamar and my mom are being, and we had just launched the spoon and it became this funny sort of like lightning rod for the Me Too movement. And then there was like tons of press about this spoon. And we went from being a company that sold on average like 20 to 30 of each item to selling like 2,000 spoons.
Did you sell 2,000 egg spoons?
Oh, yeah, over the course of the last 2 years.
Those, like, it will never die.
No, it will never die. And also because it makes really a uniquely amazing egg. Okay. We were the other day for Cherry Bomb's Jubilee, my mom and I, they'd asked us to make an egg in the egg spoon as a video, and it's now on our Instagrams and IGTV. And before starting out, I didn't tell the audience that we only had one egg, which we only did. We only had one egg left in quarantine. And there was like genuine concern that we were going to fuck it up or like burn it or something. And so we go in and like my mom turns out the perfect egg. There's like a brief harrowing moment where there's a like live ember on the lip of the spoon. My mom's like trying to flick it off without setting the egg on fire, but you can see it in action on Instagram. And it does just do something really amazing to the egg. And this version, and actually it looks like yours does too, the quite domed bottom means you can also use it on a gas stove. So we do occasionally not cook with it over fire, which makes it slightly more accessible.
They're also good for roasting oysters.
Maybe even a mussel, going back to, might be worth trying.
Mussel, yeah, you can find a good one. I think that there is something worth addressing in the question of like chewiness and preciousness, because there's one way of kind of reading this beautiful childhood and upbringing that you had. It's like, oh my God, this is so lucky and beautiful, like, in the embrace of Berkeley amazingness and aesthetic perfection. But there's another, I think a way that a correlate way, which is like, these are the simplest pleasures. And the stuff that you talk about, like when you talk about where you guys go when you travel, when you go to Provence, like it's very, like it's pretty hearty, like you talk about kind of like always ruining guest houses and your mom making a grill, and the stuff that you guys love that you describe so poetically is actually not stuff that you can even necessarily buy. It's more like stuff that you can like have the privilege of having the time to notice.
That's a nice way of putting it.
And I wondered if you have any thoughts on this sort of that way of reading your life, or that way of reading any experience, and that way of reading your mom's message, which is like, oh, this is so precious, or like, wait a minute, this is actually like deeply revolutionary because this is something you can't buy, you can just see or have the time to see.
I think that's a really, really good point. It's one of the things that I thought about a lot writing this book, because I've lived my life in tremendous privilege. Like, it hasn't been entirely of the monetary sort, but there hasn't been, nor has that been, there been an acute absence of comfort. So I feel, I was aware that of how some of these stories might sound, or just how I could best tell them so that they didn't feel like they were ringing sort of, false somehow, that they were really an authentic reflection of what was most redeeming about these stories, or what was most important or, primal about these stories, is that they are actually quite universal. It's about how humans relate to one another. It's about how, if they're tuned into themselves and into their senses, they can experience beauty all around them, and I, there are the stories of going to fancy restaurants when I was 9 years old, because my mom had a professional responsibility at a certain point to actually go visit some of the places in France that were opened by friends or colleagues or whatever. It's kind of getting a lay of the land. And I did and still do have a character, the character flaw of great love of lobster. And it's just something I'm gonna have to own, because I realize that doesn't come off, well, generally. But, and there is a story about requesting a lobster salad after a harrowing brush with extreme vomiting malady in a car sickness. But I think really what you're getting at, and is something that I really hoped would be the most, like the core of this book, which was that beauty is something that is not associated with a price tag. And it's like what you say, it is about time. It's about the luxury sometimes of having time to pay attention. But it's, there's very little in our house that's really precious. There's just, there's been a lot of care in how things were brought into our house, whether it was a 50-cent wooden spoon from a flea market, or a bowl that my mom somehow managed not to break over 45 years, but or she has broken and it's just been glued together a million times. And I do say, in the book, like, even those things get thrown back into the dishwasher, because there is this prevailing attitude of just needing to be open to living with things, like really living with things, doing things with that kind of intention of experiencing them fully. So it's why also smell enters so much into the book, is because it's also about doing things in your environment that actually like change the atmosphere in a tangible way. And I've been talking about this a lot because people are all in their homes, and like, how do you feel different from one room to the next? And how do you stay sort of in your body and engaged? And it's like, actually, if you, and I loved listening to you again in your audiobook, and just the way you're describing boiling water and the ritual even of just boiling water and salting water, and how that becomes both a timekeeping measure and also an atmosphere lending apparatus. It's like it becomes, even water becomes incense in a kind of way, or and I think like I end up talking about things that are very much in that vein. It's like lighting a branch of rosemary to signal that you're like back in a space, or that you're entering a new space in a new way with a different intention. And like every day, going out for a walk, if you pick, granted Berkeley is a little green idyll, but going out for a walk, there's all these aromatic things. You can just grab a handful of rose petals or a little sprig of lavender or something, and those things just help us stay embodied. And I think like it's really hard to do that right now. It's really hard.
Yeah. But I loved when you wrote about chicken stock as your mom's version of that. But I do think anything works, right? It's about making your human imprint on a place, and ideally it's something that you can eat too, because people are hungry.
We rented a house in Sicily. My mom had been just dying to go back to Sicily. She hadn't gone in years, and we stayed for 3 weeks in the rainiest season of all time outside of Palermo, in this little suburb called Mondello. And it was the house was not very expensive, and on Airbnb, unfortunately, you can't smell your house before you rent it, and it was just so damp. There was this like terrible mold, and I walked in, I was like, no way, we're leaving. And my mom was like, hold on. And she aired out the house and then just put on chicken stock. And as soon as like the gleam and warmth of chicken stock, she would almost start making a new chicken stock as soon as the last. Like, we just had to have continuous pots of chicken stock going to like make the house smell.
Did it work?
Like, it did. I mean, it was insane, because it was sort of like a baseline of mildew, and with this like beautiful brothy smell overlay. And I have, needless to say, a very almost punishingly acute sense of smell. So I was sort of in a like low level misery, but I just loved that I had just already at that point written that chapter in the book. And I was like, this is still so true of my mom. Like, this is still the method, and it still is it's like a trusted method. It still works.
Yeah. We're about to, I think, run out of time, but I really wanted you to read the octopus part. Can you read this?
Oh yes, I'll read a little of the octopus. You did slightly give it away, but yes.
That worked? Nothing. Okay.
Let me find it.
This is a really, really funny part, and it's so beautiful. And it also, this is one of the ones that reminded me not of learning something from your mom, but I was like, I would do this exact thing. Like, this is something that would happen to me. My kid will find this nugget in my bag for sure.
Yes, let me just find. So mystery nugget. I had marked it. Okay, 285. All right. So this is a story of being up in this snow in the Sierras. We were staying at a family friend's cabin at the ski resort Twain Harte, and were snowed in, but actually snowed in, not just the result of our collective antipathy toward gelid landscapes. I must have been about 7 at the time, an age when sorting through one's mother's belongings was good enough entertainment for an afternoon. So to pass the time, I undertook a grand emptying of my mom's perpetually chaotic handbag. My mom is not a slovenly person. Our house is tidy. She appreciates order. She infrequently lets a dirty dish dwell in the sink for longer than a few hours. Take one look in her purse, however, and you would believe otherwise. I used to dread the request to locate something, usually her iconic rose-colored sunglasses, from within the bag while she was driving. It typically meant brushing one's fingertips against something that's shadowy and foreign, and often eerily organic, but decidedly not of the USDA-approved variety. There was always a school of loose business cards swimming around its depths, their surfaces bronzed and corners blunted from the absence of a proper sheath. Reliably, an assortment of rumpled receipts had also collected in a corner, like a pile of meticulously raked and then abandoned leaves. There also always seemed to be something gritty and sand-like mixed with a bit of lipstick from an uncapped shade of dark burgundy, my mother's 90s lip hue, and together filmed the inner lining. This was probably salt. A little wax paper and envelope of the condiment does sometimes travel with my mother for emergency picnics and or unexpected opportunities for seasoning, but it was always impossible to say for sure while blindly fishing around in the tenebrous abyss for the requested spectacles. Anyway, on this particular snowy afternoon, I laid out the entire contents of the bag on the dining table and began to sort through the mixture of valuables and jetsam. I grouped receipts in a neat pile, gathered business cards of new acquaintances, and sifted out my mother's own, reunited the uncapped lipstick with its chapeau, used my palm to iron out creased bills that had been shoved here and there rather than, sorry, I just got some weird windows popped up. After spending some time organizing the various credit cards and IDs according to a 7-year-old system of order, i.e. by color rather than function, I found in the remotest corner of a side pocket a tiny shriveled dark brown nugget. I plucked it from its nook and, like any child would, smelled it immediately. The top note was, needless to say, dust, cut with a bit of leather, but the bottom note was unmistakably fishy. I inhaled more deeply. Yes, whatever this rubbery, shriveled little thing was, it had had a previous life in the ocean. Specimen in hand, I turned to my mom, who was reading on the couch, and said, "Mom, you have fish in your purse." Her first distracted response, voice monotone and uninflected, was, "What? That's impossible." She didn't look up from the magazine, so I marched over to her, extended my palm. "It's dried fish. Look." She glanced at it. I could tell she was still failing to take me seriously and said, "I have no idea what that is. I'm sure it's nothing." "Smell it, Mom. I think it's squid." Squid? She leaned forward and sniffed. Several seconds passed in silence as a wave, more a tsunami of recognition, began to gather force, preparing to sweep through her brain. "Oh my God, you're right, Fan. It's a piece of octopus." And indeed it was. And indeed it was.
Oh my God. So wait, why did your mom have octopus in her handbag?
To sum it up, she had been in Japan more than a year before that, and had been unable to actually just masticate and choke down this piece of octopus that was raw and proffered to her at this very high style Japanese restaurant. And my dad actually gagged it down, but they chewed it, he said, for 10 or 15. He thought, my mom said 20 minutes, but they both were almost defeated by it. And my mom said she nearly threw up at the restaurant because she couldn't, she was trying so hard, finally managed to get it into her purse.
Into her bag.
Where a fair amount of restaurant food was squirreled away over the years. But this was unique in that it remained for a very, very long time and remained aromatic enough that I was able to discern something of its origins a year plus later.
That's amazing. I think that's amazing. I think we're supposed to take some questions.
Yeah, great.
So Gina says perfect title. That's just a compliment. But then also says, I loved the first Fragola chapter. Was the gelato your first sense memory? P.S. She's making an apple galette tomorrow per your recipe.
Good luck with that. I did test that recipe, but I'm not a great baker. Full admission. But it is, yeah, that strawberry ice cream, which I describe in that chapter, is the first time I really remember cold coupled with taste, smell. There were no photographs of that. And I don't remember my mom even really telling me the story, but I came to her and said, was there a strawberry
Ice cream
thing when
one.
I was really little, cold, did I like choose an ice cream somewhere? And she was like, oh my God, because I was really small. It was during their, my parents got married when I was 2, and it was during their honeymoon.
Whoa, is that the only thing you remember from that?
Nothing else. Nothing until I was 13, frankly. So, which is not true, of course. There are many stories in this book that speak to a younger age, but I don't have one of those insane perfect memories. I mean, it's why so many of the memories are very sense oriented and driven by an overwhelming sort of smell or color or texture or something like that. So, but that story, it really is the real concrete memory. And it totally it was my first time eating sugar too. So it was mind blowing.
Yeah. There is another question from Jess, and it is, do you have advice for introducing unfamiliar ingredients to children and teens?
Well, Tamar probably has better advice because she has a child, and I don't yet. But I will, from what I remember, my mom was very good at when she was giving me something new. There was never any insistence that I eat all of it or that I like it, but that I taste it, a little bite at least, and then tell her what I didn't or did like about it. So it was a real engaged process. I was asked to kind of create language for why I liked something or didn't like something, which also gave me more of a vocabulary too for tastes and things. So I feel like that was an early education, almost also in terms of my lexicon, not just in terms of how I was, in terms of my palate. But my mom always talks about how, you never know, kids can be so almost arbitrary and mercurial with their likes and dislikes. And so she says, if one day you weren't really eating radishes sliced one way, I just slice them differently. And sometimes, I thought I needed to take a cucumber skin off for you to eat cucumber, but then I just would give you the peeler and then you'd peel it and then you'd eat the skin or do something sort of unexpected. There was a way of even just changing the appearance of something with a seasoning on it. And I think cutting shapes and interesting shapes out of ingredients is one kind of sure way to keep things diverse and keep kids kind of engaged and interested. But Tamar, maybe you have more lived advice.
Well, I'll keep it brief because there are more questions, but my lived advice is to, number one, remember that kids are changing all the time. So when you make an assumption based on a static being, you're making a mistake. I make no assumptions about what Lewis will and won't eat based on yesterday. I never say he likes things or doesn't like things. I just try to I just have nothing to do with it. I just serve a healthy array of delicious things every night. And sometimes, and at every meal, there's something he will reliably eat. If it seems like he won't, I try to check in before a meal and then expand it a little bit. Tonight I was making I made the most hilariously shaped panisi meal, but there was one part of it that was going to be just potatoes, and he saw I was making chicken soup with rice, but then I wanted it to be congee, so I made it thicker, and he likes broth more than rice. I just want just some plain meat, and I was like, oh, I can do a layer of thinly sliced kind of seared beef on top of steamed potatoes, and so I did that. And he had that and a little bit of the chicken soup with rice. But I just think basically making no assumptions, offering whatever, and never giving anything special, never placing special values on one thing or another. Some days he eats a lot of pea shoots, then he makes ew noises at them, and then it's all the same. All right, let's go back to you. Is there any food or dish that you've been making a lot during this time that is sustaining you?
Yes, actually, a very Tamar-esque soup. We've been making and not throwing away a single vegetable scrap right now. So we are making a different vegetable stock every week with everything that we've accumulated. So I've started keeping a freezer bag just full of every little odd and end that I'm taking off whatever I'm cooking. And I'm like pretty inclusive about that. The one thing I don't really put in there is any bitter greens, because I found that those do sometimes make your broth kind of inedibly bitter. And obviously fruits and citrus, and other things. My mom's just calling it the compost broth, but it's really more like than zero waste vegetable stock. And it's been so delicious. It's just not something I was doing before, but because I'm very conscious of not wanting to throw away nutrition, because we're still we're very lucky in California. We're getting a fair amount of nice produce still. And yet we're still running through vegetables quickly and finding that we don't have everything that we would like to have or might routinely buy. And this preserves these flavors. And I also think it gives a nice sort of sense of time to each week, not just because you have this ritual, but because you taste the different things. Like one week we had a bunch of radishes that we were eating in salads, and I used the greens in the stock, and it just changed the flavor of that. And I was able to sort of look back and think, this is the week of radishes. And, and it's a way to kind of, I think we all really need ways to like mark the passage of time right now, but also to appreciate what was within that space of time. And so reflect back on it, look back at it, and through taste and through smell is one of the most effective kind of ways of engaging with time. It's one of the things that, I'm going to digress for a moment, but I only went to Japan for the first time, I guess about 2 years ago with my mom. And it was the thing that blew my mind was the attentiveness to the passage of time through seasonality. Obviously, we all know about sakura season and the cherry blossoms and going in the spring, but the appreciation in Japanese cooking for these ingredients that exist for like a flash, it was the 3 days of the sancho pepper flowers, and that you eat right when we went was before full spring. And the way that a lot of the flavors were described, which were a lot of bitter flavors in the tempura, like butter burr, or these little buds of things that were found and collected in the woodland areas that all have a bitterness to them. And I was asking about that flavor, which for me, like my palate thrills to that flavor. And I was like, this is just delicious. And it's like, it's the way that we remember the winter past before the full embrace of spring. Like the poetry in that, it's like tasting the last of the bitterness and processing it out of our systems, that there's something, but also a reverence for the bitterness itself, and we're in a bitter fucking period right now. Like, it's almost like we have to taste this bitterness, and we're also going to have to remember it. But doing some of that through cooking, I think, is like a healthy way of engaging with it, or at least a kind of meditation.
Lindsay asks, of all the places or countries you visited, what has been your most memorable and why? If you were to suggest a place to go for a month, where would you advise to go?
That's a good question. It's a hard one to answer. On the one hand, I mean, having never been to Japan before that trip, that was one of the most mind-blowing trips, culinarily and otherwise, art history, culture. But it would have been a hard place for me to be for a month, I think, as someone who's with a very foreign culture. So I think it really depends on, what you know and how much you can sort of comfortably adapt to a place. I really, really love Sicily. Having spent some time in Palermo, I love that city. And it's really lively, and it's a collision of so many different cultures, and the food is amazing. And the countryside is amazing. So, but it's like, it's comforting to me, and it's familiar, and because those are flavors that I grew up with to some extent. So I guess I just recommended Japan and Sicily. So there you go.
Clifton Smith says, what are y'all talking about? But I don't know if that's because of a tech issue. But if there's more that you want to write to elaborate on that, then you should. And then there's also, and then Claire says, I'm obsessed with your cracker, nut butter, and sprouts number.
Oh, yes.
Can you give us another brilliant snack idea? Tamar, chime in with some garbage-related delicacies. My specialty.
Well, I will tell you, I've just really been needing some serious carbs right now. It's just been feeling really important to my diet. So the simplest, most gratifying snack is for me like a piece of bread. Everyone's apparently baking sourdough bread themselves, so everyone should have access to this, or at least hopefully. And just I toast it, rub it with garlic, a fresh clove of garlic, slathered in olive oil, and that is like a little bit of sea salt and garlic toast, which is basically an accompaniment to almost every meal that we had in our household, is also my now interstitial snack of choice.
Interstitial snack. That I wish I were known for making interstitial snacks instead of garbage related, but I'm not. I have been making potato peels, which is super delicious. And then today, and I just do a ton of olive oil and salt, and then, roast them like pretty hot, lots of olive oil, lots of salt. And then as soon as I take out the potato peels, I mean, this is of course assuming you've made potatoes and then you're stuck with potato peels, like whatever, they can sit in water for a day or two. But if you're just trying to not waste everything, and then cover them in scallions, and then like some sort of a very simple but slightly melty cheese, like a tome style cheese. And then today I made potato chip cookies.
Yeah, I saw that. Very intrigued.
Crazy. It's kind of like a sandy, also like I don't bake, and I don't really like sweets, but I'm making potato chip cookies. But it's like, the very end of the bag of potato chips where like you didn't want to throw it away, but your hand was getting gross at the bottom. Just like the little bits. And like I love potato chips, so this is a regular thing for us to have around. But it's just like the little bits at the bottom, you're like, I'm not gonna throw it away. And so then you just don't. But then what do you do? And what's great is that it's like I used about half a cup of potato chips, and Lewis took a rolling pin and just smashed it, which like was really cathartic for both of us, I think. And then it was just salt, butter, flour, and sugar, but not so much. And then like I had like at some point made cinnamon toast, but then he didn't want, I don't even know what happened, but I like scraped off the cinnamon butter because he didn't want or maybe he didn't eat all his toast. And so I'm like a crazy person. So I scraped off the cinnamon butter so I could save that and then save the bread itself to make croutons or breadcrumbs. Anyway, that all became such a good cookie.
I look forward to that recipe.
I'll put it up later.